Hey everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. If you're new here, I'm Lily, and I'm so glad you stopped by. Before we dive into today's episode, I want to remind you that if you enjoyed this content, please hit that share button and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any future episodes. And here's the thing, we've got an entire podcast playlist on our channel with more episodes like this one, so make sure to check that out after this video wraps up. I promise you'll find some real gems there. Now, let's get into it, because what I'm about to share with you today might just change everything about how you think about learning and language. So here's a question I want you to sit with for a moment. What if everything you've been told about learning a language is actually backwards? What if the traditional approach, the one that's been drilled into us for decades, is actually working against what we're trying to accomplish? I know that sounds dramatic, but stay with me. Today, I want to talk about something that sounds too simple to be true, but the evidence behind it is honestly incredible. I'm going to share with you a number that's going to surprise you. Ready? 375. No, wait, actually, it's higher than that. Try this one, 521. That's the number I want to focus on today, 521. And here's the wild part. This specific number could be the key to unlocking your fluency in a language you're trying to learn. Now, I know what you're thinking. That number sounds impossibly small. You've probably spent years studying vocabulary, building lists, using flashcard apps, doing everything right according to the traditional methods, yet you still feel stuck. So how could such a small number possibly be enough? Let me paint a picture for you. Think about your native language for a second. The language you grew up speaking since you were a kid. How many different words do you think you actually use in your daily life? Not how many words you know. I mean, how many do you actually genuinely use when you're talking to people, making decisions, living your life? Go ahead and think about yesterday specifically. What was the real count of unique words that came out of your mouth? If you're being honest with yourself, that number is probably way smaller than you'd expect. Most people are stunned when they do this exercise because we all assume we're using this massive range of vocabulary every single day. But the truth is, we're using the same words over and over again. We're recycling the same phrases, the same expressions, the same structures. And here's what's fascinating. We manage perfectly fine with this limited set. We express complex ideas, share our feelings, make decisions, handle problems, have relationships, all with a pretty small core of words that we use repeatedly. This is where everything changes in your thinking about language learning. If you only need a small set of words to function fluently in your native language, why would it be different for a language you're learning? Why would learning English or Spanish or French or any language require you to memorize thousands upon thousands of words when fluent speakers themselves use a much more limited core vocabulary in their everyday interactions? The system that's been taught to us, the one that says you need to learn 10,000 words, or 5,000, or even 2,000, this system is based on a false premise. It assumes that vocabulary size is the main barrier to fluency, but it's not. I'm going to say that again because it's important. It's not. The barrier is not vocabulary size. The barrier is vocabulary depth. It's the difference between recognizing a word and owning it, between knowing what it means and being able to use it naturally, fluently, without thinking about it. Let me tell you why I'm so convinced about this number specifically. Over the last few years, I've been studying language acquisition patterns, looking at research on how people actually achieve fluency, and analyzing what separates the people who become conversationals confident from those who stay stuck despite years of study. What I found was remarkable. The learners who break through, the ones who suddenly feel comfortable having conversations, who stop translating in their heads, who start thinking in the language they're learning, they share one thing in common. It's not that they know more words than anyone else. It's that they know their core vocabulary at a depth that allows them to use it flexibly, naturally, and with confidence. Now let's talk about where this number 521 comes from. It's not arbitrary. It's based on analysis of real conversations, examination of which words actually appear most frequently in authentic language use, and observation of what vocabulary sets actually allow people to handle the vast majority of everyday situations. These 521 words are your foundation. They're not the entire building, but they're the solid ground on which you build everything else. And here's what's really important. These are words you're probably already somewhat familiar with. You might recognize them, you might even know what they mean, but you probably haven't developed the depth with them that would let you use them instinctively. Let me break down what these 521 words actually consist of. First, you've got about 80 to 90 words that are action words, verbs. These are words like go, come, want, need, like, think, feel, make, take, give, help, see, hear, understand. These are the building blocks of literally any sentence you want to construct. Then you've got another 70 to 80 words that deal with emotions, opinions, and states. Tired, happy, sad, angry, nervous, excited, worried, confused, interested. These matter more than people realize because human conversation is fundamentally about sharing experiences and emotions. Next, you've got a significant chunk, maybe 90 to 100 words, that are connector words and question words. These are the small words that people often overlook because they seem too basic to matter. Words like and, but, because, so, if, when, while, although, who, what, where, when, why, how. These might seem simple, but they're absolutely critical to fluent speech because they allow you to connect your thoughts, ask clarifying questions, and sound natural rather than robotic. The remaining words cover time expressions, common objects, basic descriptions, pronouns, and other essentials. Here's what I find fascinating about this breakdown. These categories aren't random. They're not just a list someone made up. They represent the actual architecture of how language works in real communication. Every category serves a specific function that you need in order to navigate a conversation. You need action words to talk about what's happening. You need emotional words to share how you feel about things. You need connectors to show relationships between ideas. You need question words to keep conversations moving forward. You need time words to locate events in a sequence. Everything has a purpose. Now I want to tell you about something I call the multiplication effect, because understanding this might be the most important insight from this entire episode. A single word becomes exponentially more powerful when you learn to use it in different forms and contexts. Let's take a simple word like want. When you truly own this word, you can say, I want, I wanted, I don't want, I want to, I want you to, I really want, I don't want to. Do you want? What do you want? I've always wanted. I don't really want that. See how one word can branch out into dozens of different sentences? This is crucial to understand. You're not just learning 521 isolated words. You're learning 521 word families, each capable of expressing multiple related ideas. When you combine this multiplication effect with the connector words, the ands, the buts, the becauses, suddenly your ability to express yourself expands exponentially. You're not doubling your capability with 100 new words. You're multiplying your capability several times over because you're learning how to combine and recombine what you already know. Here's something that might sound counterintuitive, but I want you to really sit with it. A person who deeply knows and actively uses 500 words can often communicate more effectively than a person who passively knows 5,000 words. Think about that for a moment. The person with 500 words who has practiced them in real conversations, who has felt comfortable using them, who has combined them in different ways, that person can express themselves clearly, maintain conversations, and build rapport. The person with 5,000 words who has just added them to a list, who has never really practiced using them, who freezes up when they need to speak, that person might actually struggle more, despite knowing more vocabulary. This is why I get a little bit frustrated with traditional language learning approaches. They focus on breadth when they should be focusing on depth. They celebrate when you add the 1,000th word to your vocabulary, but they don't celebrate when you use a word you already knew in a completely new way. They don't acknowledge the true skill, which is learning to work with what you have, learning to be creative with limited resources, learning to explain, describe, and express yourself using a focused toolkit. Let me give you a real example of how this plays out. Imagine you don't know the word embarrassed. You know it would be useful in a conversation, but you just don't know that specific word. What do? Do you freeze up and go silent, hoping the moment passes? Or do you think of the words you do know, words like ashamed, uncomfortable, nervous, afraid, shy, bad? You put those together. Maybe you say, I feel very uncomfortable when people look at me. You've communicated the core of what you meant using words you already know. And here's the thing, fluent speakers do this all the time. They'll say something's kind of awkward instead of using a more precise term. They'll say something was weird and uncomfortable instead of the word bizarre. They're constantly working with a practical, usable set of words rather than reaching for rare or academic vocabulary. This skill, the ability to express yourself with the words you have rather than being paralyzed by the words you lack, this is an actual skill that develops with practice. And developing this skill is almost certainly more valuable to your fluency than adding more words to your passive vocabulary. When you practice this skill, you're training yourself to think flexibly, to problem solve in the language, to keep conversations moving forward rather than interrupting flow to search your brain for a specific word. Now, I want to address something head-on because I think some of you might be having this thought. You might be thinking that if you only learn 521 words, you'll be limited to very basic conversations. You'll be stuck talking about basic daily activities, and you won't be able to discuss anything interesting or complex. And I want to directly challenge that assumption. It's not true. You can have profound conversations with basic vocabulary. You can discuss philosophy, relationships, dreams, fears, hopes, all with simple words. What you can't do, what nobody can do, is have a conversation using words you don't actually know. You can only use the words you know. I want to share a story with you. There's a woman named Sophia who moved to a new country for work about 5 years ago. She didn't speak the local language at all when she arrived, but she was determined to connect with people and participate in her community. So she made a conscious decision. Instead of trying to learn everything systematically from textbooks, she decided to find the core words she needed for her specific life. She worked in marketing. She learned words related to her job. She lived near a market, so she learned words for food and shopping. She had neighbors, so she learned basic social words. She had a hobby, photography, so she learned those specific words. By year 2, Sophia had maybe 400 words that she felt comfortable using. But something was different about her from people who had studied the language for the same amount of time through traditional methods. She could have actual conversations. She could make small talk. She could handle unexpected situations. She could joke a little bit. And the reason was simple. Those 400 words weren't just in her head, they were in her mouth, in her practice, in her actual life. She had used each of them dozens or hundreds of times in real contexts. She knew how they fit together. She knew which ones worked with which other ones. She had developed fluency, even though her vocabulary was technically limited. This is the insight that changes everything. Fluency doesn't come from vocabulary size. Fluency comes from vocabulary depth combined with practice. It comes from using words again and again until they become automatic, until you don't have to think about them, until they're as natural to you as the words in your native language. And this is something that's absolutely within reach for anyone who's willing to focus and practice intentionally. Let me talk about a specific category of these 521 words that I think is underestimated. I'm talking about what I call transition words or connector words. These include words like and, but, because, so, if, when, while, although, however, instead, otherwise, besides, meanwhile, similarly. Now, I know these words sound boring. I know they don't seem important compared to nouns and verbs, but listen to how important they are for your fluency. These words are what allow you to move from speaking in short, choppy, disconnected sentences to speaking in a flowing, natural way that sounds like actual conversation. Think about the difference between these two ways of speaking. First way, I woke up late, I was stressed, I went to work, my boss was understanding. Now compare that to, I woke up late and I was stressed, but I still went to work because I knew my boss would be understanding. The second version uses exactly the same vocabulary. You don't need any new words, but the connector words create flow, connection, and sophistication. The same information sounds completely different. That's the power of mastering these connector words. Here's a practice I want to suggest to you. Take 2 simple sentences that you can already say comfortably in the language you're learning. Sentences about your actual life. Now practice connecting them with different connector words and see how the meaning subtly shifts. For example, I like coffee and I don't sleep well. You can connect them as I like coffee but I don't sleep well, or I like coffee so I don't sleep well, or I like coffee even though I don't sleep well, or I like coffee because I don't sleep well. Each one has a slightly different meaning, and by practicing this, you're learning not just individual words, but how to construct meaning through combination. Now let's talk about feeling and emotion words, because these are essential and undervalued in language learning. People often focus on nouns and verbs, thinking those are the important words. But think about an actual conversation with someone you care about. A huge percentage of that conversation is probably about feelings. Someone asks, "How was your day?" And your answer involves feelings. It was stressful. I was bored. I felt productive. Someone asks about your opinion on something, and you're expressing feelings. I'm not sure. I'm skeptical. I'm hopeful. The words for feelings are constantly being used in real conversations, yet they're often buried in vocabulary lists and treated as secondary. The core feeling words are not that many. You've probably got happy, sad, angry, nervous, excited, tired, confused, frustrated, interested, bored, worried, scared, proud, embarrassed, disappointed, relieved, grateful. That's only about 17 words, and yet variations of these cover a huge percentage of how people actually express their emotional states. When you truly own these words, when you can say them naturally, when you can express gradations like a little bit happy or extremely frustrated, when you can combine them with other words, I'm frustrated but also excited, you've suddenly got the ability to describe the inner emotional reality that's central to human connection. I want to give you a challenge for this week. Choose 3 feeling words that you know the meaning of, but don't use very often in actual conversation. Maybe something like anxious, hopeful, or content. Now, I want you to find 3 genuine moments in your actual life where you feel that emotion. And in those moments, I want you to say it out loud to yourself or to someone else. I'm feeling hopeful about this. I'm a bit anxious about that meeting. I feel really content right now. The point is not to be perfect. The point is to connect the word to a real feeling in your real life and to use your mouth to practice it. That's when a word moves from the category of words I recognize to words I use. Now, I want to talk about what I think is holding a lot of language learners back. I think the core problem is that we've been taught that fluency is the destination, and everything before that is just preparation. We study, we learn, we drill, we wait for the day when we'll finally feel ready to have a real conversation. But here's what I've observed in people who successfully become fluent. That's not how it works. They don't study until they're ready to speak. They speak, imperfectly, from the beginning. They have conversations where they make mistakes. They use words incorrectly. They pause and struggle. but they do this in real contexts, with real people, with actual stakes. And this is how they develop fluency. The 521 words I'm talking about are not meant to be studied perfectly from a list and then put away. They're meant to be practiced in your actual life. You're meant to use them in conversations, in writing, in thinking. You're meant to make mistakes with them and correct those mistakes through feedback. You're meant to discover through experience which combinations sound natural and which ones sound awkward. You're meant to use them so often that using them becomes automatic. Let me tell you about another person. His name is Raj, and he learned English in a very non-traditional way. He was passionate about soccer, and he wanted to understand the game better, so he started watching sports commentary in English. He didn't understand most of it at first, but he kept going back to the same commentators, the same shows. And something interesting happened. He started picking up words through sheer exposure and repetition. Goal, tackle, defense, attack, striker, goalkeeper. These words became familiar because he heard them over and over in context. He heard the excitement in the commentator's voice. He saw what was happening on the field. The words weren't abstract, they were attached to meaning and emotion. After about a year, he could follow most soccer commentary without subtitles. Now here's what's interesting about Raj's story. Did he learn a massive vocabulary? No. Did he learn words that were relevant to soccer? Yes. Did he learn them through drill and flashcards? No. Did he learn them through exposure, interest, and repetition in context? Absolutely. And more importantly, he learned them at a depth that allowed him to use them. He doesn't just recognize the word striker, he understands it in the context of the game. He's seen it used dozens of times. He's heard it with emotional inflection. He's seen how native speakers use it. That's depth. This is why I want to emphasize that this method of focusing on 521 core words is not something you do in isolation. It's a framework for intentional, focused learning, but it has to be combined with actual use. You choose words that matter for your life. You practice them in contexts that matter to you. You use them repeatedly until they become natural. That's the secret that traditional methods often miss. Here's something I think about a lot. In our modern world, we have more access to language learning resources than ever before. Apps, websites, videos, podcasts, courses, there's an overwhelming amount of material available. And yet, many people who have access to all of this are still struggling with fluency. Why? I think it's because we're confusing information with transformation. We're gathering knowledge without practicing skill. We're trying to solve a speaking problem with a learning approach. Speaking is a skill, and skills are only developed through practice, feedback, and repetition. When you focus on 521 core words instead of trying to master thousands, you're making a strategic choice. You're saying, I'm going to choose depth over breadth. I'm going to practice these words until they become natural. I'm going to use them in my actual life instead of just studying them. That's a fundamentally different approach than most language learning, and that's exactly why it works better. Let me give you a simple structure you can follow if you want to implement this. Every single day, choose 5 words from your core vocabulary. These shouldn't be completely new words. They should be words you know a little bit but don't use very often. For each word, write down one sentence about your actual life. Keep it personal and real. Don't make up example sentences that have nothing to do with you. Your sentences should reflect your actual experiences, thoughts, and feelings. Then, and this is important, read those 5 sentences out loud. Don't rush through them. Read them with appropriate emotion and expression. When you do this exercise every day, something remarkable happens. In 30 days, you've practiced 150 words in a personal, meaningful way. In 60 days, you've practiced 300 words. In 90 days, you've practiced 450 words. After 120 days of this simple daily practice, you've covered most of your core vocabulary, and you've done it at a depth that means you can actually use these words. You're not just recognizing them on a page, you've been using them to describe your actual life. You've heard yourself speak them. You've connected them to personal meaning. That's how a word becomes truly yours. Now, let me address something that might be making some of you uncomfortable. This approach sounds easy, maybe too easy. We've been conditioned to believe that real learning has to be difficult, that improvement has to be painful, that struggling through massive textbooks and complicated grammar explanations is necessary. But that's not actually true. The most effective learning is often simple, focused, and directly connected to actual use. The difficulty isn't in the method, the difficulty is in the consistency. The difficulty is in showing up every day, even when it feels simple, and doing the practice. I want to share with you something about language learning that changed my perspective completely. For decades, traditional teaching approaches have been built on this model. Accumulate knowledge, then apply it. Learn all the grammar rules, then start speaking. Learn a large vocabulary, then have conversations. But here's what we know from actual research about how people learn. The reverse often works better. Learn by doing. Have conversations, even imperfectly, and develop the knowledge through that practice. The speaking comes first, and the knowledge develops as a result of the speaking. This doesn't mean you never study or think about grammar or learn structures. It means that you do this in service of your actual use. You learn a grammar point because you need it to express something you want to say. You learn a new word because you need it to talk about something important in your life. The learning is pulled by real need rather than pushed by a curriculum. One more thing I want to discuss is what I call the confidence multiplier. Here's what I've observed. When you have control over a limited set of vocabulary, your confidence increases dramatically. You know what you can say. You know how to combine your words. You know your edges, where your vocabulary ends and you need to work around it. This actually creates more confidence, not less. Compare this to someone with a larger vocabulary who feels uncertain, who doesn't know if they're using words correctly, who is always worried they should know some other word. That person often has less confidence despite knowing more vocabulary. When you focus on mastering 521 words, you develop this confidence. You know your toolkit, you're comfortable in your boundaries, and paradoxically, this comfort actually makes you a better communicator because you're not constantly doubting yourself. You're not afraid of speaking because you know what you're capable of. And when you do encounter a word you don't know, or a situation where your vocabulary doesn't quite cover what you want to say, you handle it with grace. You work around it, you explain it differently, and you keep the conversation moving forward. Let me tell you about a study I read that really stuck with me. Researchers looked at people who had been learning a foreign language for different lengths of time. They had some people who had been studying for just 6 months with an intensive, focused approach. They had others who had been studying for 3 or 4 years with a more traditional, spread-out approach. They then had these people have conversations with native speakers and recorded the conversations. The results were striking. The people who had done intensive, focused learning, even though they had studied for less time, were actually more fluent and confident in conversation. They had deeper knowledge of fewer words, and that translated into actual conversational ability that surpassed people with broader but shallower knowledge. This is why I'm so passionate about spreading this message, because I think there are thousands of people out there who feel stuck in their language learning. They've been studying for years. They've added thousands of words to their vocabulary. They have grammar books and study plans and apps on their phones. And yet they still feel nervous about speaking. They still feel unprepared. They still don't feel fluent. And I think the problem is not that they haven't studied hard enough. The problem is that they've been focusing on the wrong metric. They've been counting words instead of measuring use. They've been collecting vocabulary instead of developing mastery. The shift to focusing on 521 core words and developing depth with those words, it's not just a learning technique, it's a mindset shift. It's deciding that quality matters more than quantity, that actual use matters more than theoretical knowledge, that confidence and communication ability matter more than the size of your vocabulary. And once you make that shift, everything changes about your learning. Here's what I want you to do this week. I want you to list out the 10 words that you think are most important for your life and your goals. Don't think about what's supposed to be important. Think about what actually matters for how you communicate. If you're interested in business, maybe your words are related to business. If you care about sports, your words might be sports-related. If you want to have better social conversations, your words might be about feelings, opinions, and social situations. Your 10 words are personal to you. Next, I want you to find or create one sentence for each of these 10 words that relates to your actual life. Not example sentences from a textbook, real sentences about your real life and experiences. Write them down. Then, practice saying them out loud. Do this for 1 week. That's it. Just 1 week with 10 words with sentences that matter to you. See if you notice a difference in how these words feel when you use them. I want to tell you something that might sound a little bit controversial in the language learning world. I think we've been making fluency harder than it needs to be. I think we've been overcomplicating it. I think we've been putting unnecessary barriers in place by saying you need to know this many words. You need to understand this much grammar. You need to pass this test before you're ready to speak. Fluency at its core is simple. It's the ability to communicate your thoughts and understand others. You can do that with a very limited vocabulary if you have depth with that vocabulary. Now, of course, the more you learn, the more situations you can navigate, the more complex ideas you can discuss. But the foundation, the starting point, the place where it becomes possible to have actual fluent conversations, that doesn't require thousands of words. It requires a core set of words that you truly own and know how to use flexibly. I want to come back to something I mentioned earlier about the multiplier effect, because I think it deserves more attention. When you truly own a word, when you can use it in different forms, in different contexts, combined with other words, that word becomes exponentially more powerful. Let me give you a more detailed example. Take the word get. Now, in English, get is one of those words that native speakers use constantly. But it's also one of the hardest words for learners because it has so many different uses. You can say, I get it. Did you get that? Get your shoes. I got a new job. I'm getting tired. I don't get why. Can we get coffee? The situation is getting better. Let's get going. If you think of get as just one word, you might think it's simple. But if you truly own this word, if you understand all its uses and can employ them naturally, suddenly you've got a tool that expands your ability to express yourself. This is true for many of the 521 words. Each one has multiple uses, multiple contexts, multiple ways it can be combined with other words. When you develop depth with your vocabulary, you're not just learning 500 words, you're learning something much larger. Another thing I want to highlight is the importance of what I call active use versus passive recognition. Passive recognition is when you see or hear a word and you understand what it means. You can recognize it, you can identify it. Active use is when you can produce that word yourself in a conversation when you need it. It comes out naturally. You don't have to search your brain for it. The shift from passive recognition to active use is what transforms your fluency. And this shift happens through practice, through speaking, through using the word in your own sentences about your own life. One thing I think is important to understand is that this journey from 521 words to true fluency is not a rigid path. You're not locked into these 521 words forever. As you practice, as you use your core vocabulary, you'll naturally expand it. You'll encounter new words that you need. You'll get curious about expanding in certain directions, and that's wonderful. The point is not to stay limited at 521. The point is to build a solid foundation with these core words so that when you do expand, you're doing it from a place of strength and confidence rather than a place of desperation and fear. Let me address one more concern that I think some people might have. You might be thinking, what if I need a word that's not in these 521? What if I'm in a conversation and I need a specific word that I don't know? First of all, this is going to happen less than you think, because these 521 words cover the vast majority of everyday communication. But when it does happen, here's what you do. You work around it. You describe it using the words you know. You explain it. You give context. You maybe draw a picture or mime the idea. And that's completely normal and acceptable. Fluent speakers do this all the time when they encounter a word they don't know or when they momentarily forget a word. In fact, this skill, the ability to communicate despite vocabulary limitations, is one of the most valuable skills in language learning. Because fluency is not about knowing every word. Fluency is about the ability to keep communicating, to work around limitations, to understand and be understood even when everything is not perfect. When you practice with your core 521 words, you're developing this skill. You're learning to be creative with what you have. You're learning to express complex ideas using simple vocabulary. That's true fluency. Here's something I want to emphasize about the daily practice I suggested earlier. The practice of choosing 5 words, writing one sentence about your real life with each word, and then reading them aloud. This is not complicated. It's not flashy. It's not the kind of thing that looks impressive to other people. But it works. It works because it combines several things that are essential for language learning: intention, personalization, frequent repetition, and the use of your voice. When you say something out loud, you engage different neural pathways than when you just read it silently or think about it. Your brain processes it differently. Your mouth learns the shapes and sounds of the words. You're training your whole self, not just your mind. I want to tell you about one more person whose story illustrates this. Her name is Elena, and she learned English through a pretty unconventional method. She was a nurse, and she wanted to be able to work internationally, so she decided to focus on medical English. She identified about 250 words that were essential to her job: anatomy terms, procedure names, patient communication words. She practiced these words every single day, but not by drilling them in isolation. She practiced them by describing scenarios from her work. She would think about a patient she'd seen and describe their situation in English. She would talk through procedures in English. She would imagine conversations with patients and practice having those conversations. After about 6 months of this focused practice, something remarkable happened. She didn't just learn medical English, she became fluent in communicating in her professional field. And more importantly, she built confidence that extended beyond her specific vocabulary. She developed a sense of how English works, how to construct sentences, how to combine words that let her navigate conversations in her professional area. Now, technically, she was working with a more limited vocabulary than a general English learner, but her depth in the areas that mattered to her was extraordinary, and that gave her the confidence and the ability to do her job effectively. This is what I mean by strategic focus. You don't have to learn everything about English. You don't have to be able to discuss every topic with equal fluency. You can choose the areas that matter for your life and develop deep competence there. And often, that deep competence in one area actually gives you momentum to expand into other areas because you've built confidence and you've understood what's possible. As we're wrapping up this episode, I want to bring it back to the fundamental point. The number 521 is not magic. It's not a hard rule. It's not saying that every language can be spoken with exactly 521 words, or that you'll stop making progress once you know that many words. The number represents something important, though. It represents the idea that fluency is possible with a much smaller vocabulary than most of us have been told. It represents the possibility that the barrier to your fluency might not be the size of your vocabulary, but the depth of your knowledge. It represents the potential for you to become fluent much faster and much more easily than you might have thought. I'm talking about a shift in your learning approach. I'm talking about moving from quantity to quality, from collection to mastery, from theory to practice, from passive learning to active use. And I genuinely believe that this shift can change everything about your language learning journey. I believe that you can become fluent. I believe that you have far more capability than you might currently believe. And I believe that the path there is simpler and more direct than you've been told. So here's what I want to ask you as we close out this episode. What if you committed to focusing on just 500 core words for the next 90 days? Not 5,000, not 2,000, 500. What if you chose words that matter for your life and practiced them daily in sentences about your real experiences? What if you spoke them out loud regularly? What if you let yourself use them imperfectly in actual conversations? What do you think might change? How might your confidence shift? How might your fluency develop? I think if you give this approach an honest try, you're going to be surprised by how much progress you can make. You're going to realize that fluency is not as far away as you thought. You're going to discover that the words you already know are more powerful than you realized. And you're going to find a path to fluency that feels natural, achievable, and actually enjoyable rather than like an endless, grinding struggle. Before you go, I want to remind you again, if this episode resonated with you, please share it with someone you know who's learning a language. And if you haven't already subscribed to our channel, please do that now so you don't miss the next episode in this series. We're going to be diving deeper into the actual 521 words, breaking them into categories, giving you example sentences, and creating a day-by-day practice plan that you can actually implement. You'll find all of that content in our podcast playlist, so make sure to check that out after this video. I'm Lily, and I'm so grateful that you spent this time with me today. Learning a language is one of the most empowering things you can do for yourself. It opens doors, builds connections, expands your understanding of the world, and I believe that everyone is capable of becoming fluent. You're capable of it. I'm excited to be part of your journey, and I'll see you in the next episode.